I'm so glad that you're here. We are going to have a really interesting conversation and discussion with our speaker this evening. My name is Christine Kalala, and I am faculty at the University of Cincinnati in the College of Nursing. I'm an adult nurse practitioner, and I work with patients at a federally qualified health center here in town, giving primary care to the uninsured and underinsured. And we're very lucky this evening to have our speaker. And I do just want to go over a couple of housekeeping items first. Make sure that you are muted. And if you have questions as you go, as Dr. Arndt is talking, you can put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat and work the questions maybe in as we go, or we certainly will leave time at the end for questions. So we want to make sure that you feel that your voices are heard and that you are fully engaged. So as it says here, welcome to Pain and Prejudice, Inequity in the Opioid Epidemic. And I would like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker for the evening is Dr. Daniel Arndt. He is a PharmD. He is an assistant professor of pharmacy practice and administrative sciences with a focus in pain management and opioid stewardship at the University of Cincinnati, James L. Winkle College of Pharmacy. Within the College of Management in the third pharmacy professional year, and he coordinates clinical skills lab that focus on pain management. So we really have someone who knows what they're talking about, which is great. In addition to his role within the college, Dr. Arndt serves as the Pain Stewardship Clinical Pharmacy Specialist at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center and is chair of the Pain Stewardship Committee for UC Health, where he wants to develop or works to develop a system-wide pain stewardship program to optimize the practice of pain management and reduce opioid-related adverse events within not only the UC Health system, but the greater Cincinnati community. And as I mentioned, I'm an adult nurse practitioner, and I see a lot of patients that need that pain management, and that's why I'm so excited to be part of this evening. Originally, he is from Buffalo, New York. He earned both his Bachelor of Science in Pharmaceutical Sciences and his Doctor of Pharmacy from the University of Toledo. He completed a postgraduate year one residency in general pharmacotherapy, and then completed another postgraduate year as in pain specialist. He was invited to speak on a panel of academic pharmacy leaders at the 2020 American Association of College of Pharmacy Annual Conference to discuss strategies to combat burnout within pharmacy students, residents, and faculty. Dr. Arndt continues to be involved with his professional organizations nationally and locally. He has recently joined the Hamilton County Addictions Response Coalition in hopes of integrating the communities and in universities' response to the opioid overdose epidemic. With great pleasure and great interest, I welcome Dr. Arndt to speak with us tonight.
Well, Christine, thank you so much for the introduction. I really appreciate it, and I am very appreciative for all of you taking time out of your evening to come and hear a little bit about what I have to say in regards to the opioid epidemic and the systemic inequity and inequality that we've kind of seen with the opioid epidemic really all throughout our history, especially here in the United States. Before we start off today and get into the nitty-gritty, I'd like to start off with one of my favorite daytime TV game shows, Family Feud. So I'm going to ask everyone to go to menti.com, use those codes, and type in a one-word term for people who use opioids. Imagine you're on the set of Family Feud, going and trying to get that top answer.
And while they're doing that, I had one little housekeeping item that I forgot. And that was, if you can, to not turn your camera on, because it does help with bandwidth. And just so we don't have any glitches with our technology.
I'm going to give everyone about 20 more seconds or so. Alrighty. So what I'm seeing up there is a little bit all over the board. One of the most common things I see is addicts, addict, addiction, junkie, hurting, stressed. But I also see things like human, patient, everyone, patients who are lost, patients who are at risk. So there's a little bit of both. And one of the things that I see most commonly is, again, we are primarily people who are working in community care or the health professions. And the answers up here are varied, but again, one of the most common ones is still addict, addiction, and junkie. These are things that are very, very common throughout our society, and outside of the medical field, it's almost, unfortunately, the dominating view. And I want to talk a little bit today about why that is and understand the context of how we got to that point where people who use opioids have these negative words and these words with negative connotations that come to our mind as the first thing that we think of, the most common way we could describe them. And I think it really is a result of really our history and how we've gotten here. So I'm really excited today to talk about inequity of the opioid epidemic. It's a passion of mine. And before we get into me talking about the history of the opioid epidemic, I just want to say I have no financial relationships or any conflicts of interest as it may pertain to anything I'm speaking on today. So there's nothing I'm going to be selling to you, and there is nothing I'm going to be explaining for the reason of me making money or anything like that on the back end. So there's no concern there. So really, why I want to talk today and what I'm hoping we can accomplish is four main things. One, I really want you to be able to summarize the history of the opioid use throughout the United States, and then how you can discuss the national strategy and how our national strategy to curb drug use has evolved from the 20th century up until the present day. I want you to be able to recognize how stigma, bias, and systemic inequity continue to impact the treatment of both pain and addiction patients today, and then ultimately identify strategies to improve the quality of care that patients receive. So if we're going to do those four things, the first place we need to start is history. Now, long before I wanted to be a pharmacist or even knew what a pharmacist really was, I wanted to be a history teacher. I loved learning history, and I loved hearing about those who fail to learn history are doomed to repeat it, and those concepts and the importance of understanding where we come from. And now that I'm a pharmacist, I'm very excited to be able to talk today about history because it's something that repeats itself all the time. And it's not just in war or things like that. We see it in the medical field as well, and we can see it here with opioids. So in order to understand how we are going to approach the opioid crisis today, in order to take a look at that and come up with strategies to go forward, we really need to first look back and understand the context of how we got here. Operating in a bubble and just looking at, okay, this is what I see right now can work, but most of the time it doesn't. And we're going to talk a little bit more later about how that was our initial approach to the opioid crisis and how it needs to be kind of removed from our thinking going forward. So use of opioids in humans was really first dated back to the ancient Sumerians in 3400 BC. Opium growth of the poppy plant and opium really took off under King Tut in Egypt in 1300 BC, where it would eventually spread across the Mediterranean into Greece and into Europe, as well as travel along the Silk Road up into China. In as early as 460 BC, Hippocrates, who is known as the father of modern medicine, had a point that he actually wrote down about opium and its potential use and pain relieving properties. Fast forward into 1527, we have a man named Paracelsus. Paracelsus was able to make a tincture of opium in an elixir that was able to be used for pain relief. Paracelsus is also one of the inspirations for pharmacy and toxicology. He's famously quoted saying that all things are poison. What makes medicine from poison is the dose. And I'm paraphrasing that. That might not be the exact statement, but it's so true. And it's something that rings true of almost all medications, and especially we can see it with opioids. In 1803, a German pharmacist was able to take opium and extract the active ingredient, which he named morphine after the Greek god of dreams, Morpheus. And then in 1827, another German chemist was able to commercially produce morphine and begin manufacturing it and distributing it. His descendants and sons would eventually move to the United States, and they would found what's currently known as Merck and Company. So we're in the early 1830s. We're moving into American history, and we have morphine widely available and distributed in the United States. So let's fast forward into seeing what's going on in the United States at this time. Well, in the early 1840s, China had just finished the First Opium War with Britain, and they lost, which meant that they were going through an economic hardship, and times were very difficult because of all the money that they were owing to the British. At the end of the 1840s, when the gold rush started happening in California, and specifically San Francisco, because of those economic hard times in China, we started to see an influx of Chinese immigrants to the San Francisco Bay Area. In 1852 alone, there were about 20,000 Chinese immigrants just to San Francisco. They started seeing a lot of pushback, and eventually Governor John Bigler of California specifically stated that they needed to check the tide of Asiatic immigration, mostly stating the belief that they didn't feel that Chinese immigrants could assimilate to American culture and that they had a sense of moral depravity in their use of opium dens, which they had brought with them from China. A lot of anti-Chinese sentiment grew to the point where in 1854, there was a man named George Hall who murdered 4 Chinese immigrants. He was sentenced and put in jail. And in 1854, the Supreme Court of California actually reversed that decision and freed him on the basis that he was put in jail by the testimonies of Chinese witnesses. And they did not believe that Chinese immigrants could testify in court, and therefore he was set free, and pretty much no prosecutor was able to effectively prosecute Chinese immigrants afterwards, which led to increasing violence and increasing anti-Chinese sentiment. As we moved into the 1850s and 60s, we saw developments such as the hypodermic needle, which now made morphine not only available and quick acting, but able to be injected, which allowed it to be extremely fast and effective pain relief, just in time for the Civil War to begin. In the Civil War, we saw widespread opioid use in the Union Army, so much so that in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, morphine addiction was called the morphine habit and also referred to as soldier's disease. Soldier's disease actually is a bit of a misnomer, though. After the Civil War, physicians most commonly prescribed morphine to women. And by the end of the 19th century, it wasn't soldiers that was primarily who was addicted to morphine. Roughly 60% of patients who were addicted to opioids in the 19th century were actually women. Morphine was being prescribed from everything from a minor headache to menstrual cramps to the unfortunate fake diagnosis of female hysteria. It was used all the time. In 1975, physicians and the general public started to realize, wait a second, there are some risks with these drugs. We're using them all the time in patients who probably don't need them, and we're starting to see addiction take place. So there's a little bit of growing concern about their use and about how many doctors were readily distributing those opium as well as morphine. As a result of that, people who were addicted to those medications lost their supply of opium and lost their supply of morphine. So where they went to get their fix was the opium dens that had been in place since the 1850s with Chinese immigrants. And this angered a lot of white Americans, especially white Californians. Now, again, if you look back with the discrimination and laws against Chinese immigrants in the 1850s, they already believed that Chinese Americans weren't assimilating to American culture and were causing a moral decay. Now, all of a sudden, they saw white women flock to opium dens, and this really started what was known as the Yellow Peril, where they blamed all of this opium addiction on Chinese immigrants. They viewed Chinese immigrants as savages who came in and got their women addicted to opium and then brought them into their opium dens and seduced them or raped them. Just awful, awful things and awful, awful stereotypes. That became widespread to the point where that lie became widespread to the point that In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, which fully banned Chinese immigration for 10 years. Unfortunately, that continued to be re-upped every 10 years and remained in effect until 1943. And it really impacted immigration on a large scale all the way until 1965, which really is not that long ago. As we move towards the turn of the century, and the opium habit is becoming more of an issue, and we're noticing more and more patients addicted to morphine. We're seeing this not just in the United States, but abroad. In Germany, a chemical company known as Bayer formulated a non-addictive form of morphine, also named after a Greek god. It was the god that would save us from morphine addiction, heroin. Heroin, unfortunately, is really very similar to morphine. If we look in the bottom right corner here, we can still chemically, the only difference between morphine and heroin are these two little acetyl groups. Why it was thought that adding these two acetyl groups would get rid of the potentially addictive properties of morphine, no one really knows. Back in that time, there weren't requirements to show that you actually were producing a safe and effective drug that does what you say it does. What it actually does is it makes it more fat-like or lipophilic. And our brain and our blood has this barrier called the blood-brain barrier, which really prevents a lot of water-like or hydrophilic substances from getting to the brain quickly. If you look at the alcohol groups in the same spot on morphine, those are more hydrophilic or water-like. Those acetyl groups really just meant that heroin was going to get to your brain from your blood faster than morphine. Not necessarily make it more addictive. It works really the same way once it gets there, but it's going to work faster and it's going to work for a shorter amount of time, which if someone is using it to get high, they're going to get it faster and it's going to go away sooner, requiring them to take more, which does make it a little bit more risky for patients who are at risk of addiction. At the same time, in 1898, at the end of the Spanish-American War, the Treaty of Paris gave the United States ownership of the Philippines for colonial expansion. The Philippines had widespread opium use, and in 1905, Theodore Roosevelt oversaw the Philippine Opium Commission. It was a commission of missionaries from the United States to go to the Philippines and see what they should do in regards to regulating opium. They talked with a lot of people in the Chinese Qing dynasty to see how opium was handled up there. And what they learned was that opium was causing a lot of problems in the Chinese dynasty. It had caused a lot of issues with productivity. So the United States really decided that we don't want to deal with that diminished productivity in our colonial expansions. We don't want to have opium there. And the Chinese were on board with that. They said, this is good. We have seen the consequences of it. We support this, but aren't you being hypocritical? You don't even do anything at home about opium, and you're going to come here and ban the Philippines from opium. So the Philippines people were upset. The Chinese were not as thrilled as they would have been about just overall getting rid of opium in the Philippines. So the United States said, okay, well, we probably should do something. And if you think back about who was using opium and who was using other opioids like morphine and heroin in the United States, morphine, heroin, primarily white women. Smoking opium was typically something with the Chinese, associated with the Chinese immigrants. So they didn't do anything to morphine or heroin. They sent 2-year prison sentences for smoking opium in 1909, known as the Opium Exclusion Act. This really met no criticism at home because, again, this was considered something that only the Chinese immigrants were doing. What happened, though, is once this prison sentence came about, smoking opium became extremely expensive. And these Chinese immigrants needed to look for something that was cheaper. So they moved into morphine and heroin, which then brought calls for getting rid of morphine and heroin and making them illegal. There was a problem, though. The North was really on board, California was really on board, but southern states were still pretty against the idea of regulating opium and heroin, mainly because they felt that states' rights were more important. It should be a statewide decision. So a new strategy emerged, and a new enemy came out of it to get approval from the southern states. This new enemy of African American fiends who were using cocaine and now were impervious to pain. There were testimonies in Congress specifically stating that almost all crimes against white Americans in the South were perpetuated by African Americans, specifically African cocaine. It even was so pervasive that police departments in the South began getting higher caliber bullets because it was told to them that when someone was on cocaine, particularly an African American man on cocaine, you could not stop him with regular bullets. It became widespread fear mongering and propaganda in the South. That, combined with fears about smoking opium and the Chinese immigrants moving into morphine and heroin, led to the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914. This was not prohibition of opioids, not prohibition of cocaine. It was simply saying, okay, typically our white women, white users of these substances are going and being prescribed them from the physicians. At that time, addiction treatment was actually pretty consistent. You're addicted to morphine, let me dose you with a low dose of morphine each day to maintain that so you can hopefully be productive and not consistently looking for where you're going to get your next drug from. Same thing with cocaine addiction. This act did not get rid of those. It just said we're going to regulate it and it should only be medical use. So it should only be used if a physician is prescribing this medication in the course of his professional practice. So it got rid of smoking opium or using cocaine, or those who wouldn't be able to afford going to the doctor and seeing these things and getting prescribed these things, or those who a doctor would be more alerted or scared of prescribing these medications to. A big challenge happened with that, though. It ended up becoming very similar to full prohibition because law enforcement did not feel that addiction was a disease. And therefore, if addiction is not a disease, a physician prescribing opioids for addiction is not in the course of their professional practice. So they began to go after these physicians who were helping treat addiction patients. Because of that, the supply once again dried out, black market started to flourish, and things were so bad that in 1918, just 4 years later, the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States had to call for a reevaluation of this act. They said that essentially it was a failure. It was not working and crime was way up. Everything had just moved to the black market and they were concerned. So we did the most American thing possible. And instead of reversing our decision and our plan with the Harrison Narcotic Act, we doubled down and started continually increasing funding to drug enforcement and law enforcement and enforcing these drug policies. The Harrison Narcotic Act remained and was really one of the biggest influences of drug policy all the way until the 1970s. So with that, I just want to take a moment to kind of reflect upon what we just talked about. And I want you to rate the following issues on how much you felt each of them played a role in the development of the Harrison Narcotic Act, being racism, U.S. opioid addiction, and the U.S.'s desire to expand colonialism. I want to see how gauge the audience a little bit about what you're feeling there. Okay, I'll do about 5 more seconds before I'll move on. So right now, what we're saying, and I'm trying to gauge the audience here, is that the biggest factor in the Harrison Narcotic Act was racism. U.S. opioid addiction was a concern. There was a concern about addiction. But how we developed that policy had more to do with the racism than the actual opioid addiction problem. And that's something that's important to think about as we move forward and talk about future developments in drug policy. So the Harrison Narcotic Act, as I mentioned, really dominated drug policy until the 1970s. In the 1960s, leading up to the 70s, we saw the rise of the hippie movement and predominantly using marijuana, psychedelic drugs, and then also the anti-Vietnam War movement around that time as well. We're also seeing civil rights at that time. The Voting Rights Act came out in 1965. There was a lot of things going on and a lot of changes being made. In the 1970s, the Controlled Substance Act was passed, which allowed a 5-tiered drug schedule, Schedule 1 being the most addictive, no medical use drugs, to Schedule 5 being, they're a little bit concerning, but not that concerning, and then the non-scheduled, non-controlled substances. Interestingly, a lot of criticism comes out about why marijuana is listed as a Schedule 1 drug. It doesn't make that much sense that cocaine is a Schedule 2 drug, marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug, meaning it has absolutely no medical use, whereas now we're seeing the development of medical marijuana. We have FDA-approved medications specifically containing the active ingredients in marijuana for cancer patients, for appetite stimulation, for seizures in pediatric patients. It just so happens to have been named a Schedule 1 substance directly as a response to the hippie movement in the 1960s. In the 1970s, President Nixon declares a war on drugs. This is a giant shift in how Americans are going to look at drug use and respond to it in policy. Famously, in the 1990s, John Ehrlichman, who was the assistant to President Nixon for domestic affairs, largely helping oversee this war on drugs, was quoted as saying, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people." You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be black, and we couldn't make it either to be against the war. But by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt the communities, arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Which is really shocking to hear. The assistant to the president for domestic affairs, the area that the war on drugs really came about, to hear him say this. And there's a lot of speculation and rightful speculation about if this is a genuine quote. We know he said it, but John Ehrlichman was also kind of thrown under the bus by President Nixon in the Watergate scandal. So there's a lot of belief that this is kind of his way to get back at the legacy of President Nixon. So what we really need to do is look at, okay, what was Nixon's drug policy? And early on in his presidency, it really did focus more on public health initiatives, treating addiction, expanding addiction services, looking at treatment and prevention, really dealing with it from a public health standpoint. In 1972, though, when Nixon was up for re-election, his campaign was run by an advisor known as Kevin Phillips, who is notorious for developing what he wrote about called the Southern Strategy. The idea that he would play on racial fears after the Voting Rights Act of '65 to gain a lot of support in Southern states directly in response to the Voting Rights Act. Interestingly enough, in 1972, when reelected, one of the things that worked very well for that was the creation of the Drug Enforcement Agency to pair the DEA with the FBI to investigate underground drug markets, as well as go after and be able to prosecute those involved in drug use. For the rest of the 1970s, drug use remained relatively commonplace. Cocaine was common throughout the 1970s, 76 and 77. And at that point, we still typically saw cocaine as a primarily white drug. Saw about 14% of young adults who were white using cocaine as opposed to 8.2% of non-whites using cocaine. But a giant development happened in 1981. Crack was developed. A lot of people don't know what the difference between crack and cocaine necessarily is. But cocaine is a salt, cocaine hydrochloride. You can see right here on the screen on the left-hand side of this equation. And what that salt means is, if you think about how we salt the roads in the winter so that water freezes at a lower temperature, you feel that if you recognize that if you add salt to water, it's going to boil at a hotter temperature. Salt meant that this cocaine, powder cocaine, had a high melting point, which means you couldn't smoke it. You had to either snort it or dissolve it and inject it. Injection worked a lot faster than snorting. Snorting took a little bit to see the effects. In 1981, they realized that if they added baking soda to cocaine, it would actually separate that salt out and allow you to have cocaine with a lower melting point, meaning that you were able to smoke it and get the effects almost immediately. The other side effect of that is it was mixed with baking soda, which means that it was a lot cheaper because it took less of the actual drug to get you to the effect and speed up the onset of action. This made it extremely popular and common, and especially common within low-income communities that typically hadn't gone and used cocaine due to its expense. At this time in the 1980s, cocaine was typically associated with upper-class, wealthy, white individuals, whereas crack was associated with impoverished, especially African-American and Latino individuals. In 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act came out in response to the crack epidemic. It came out to serve mandatory minimum sentences to drug kingpins and mid-level distributors. Giant amounts of doses got someone a mandatory minimum sentence. You'd have to have 100 grams of heroin or 500 grams of cocaine. Now, there's a giant challenge here. You'd say, okay, well, if you have 500 grams of cocaine, if you have 100 grams of heroin, you probably are a mid-level distributor or drug kingpin. But they didn't do that for crack. That specifically says cocaine. Cocaine was viewed not as dangerous as crack at the time. So they gave it a different ratio, the sentencing ratio. Cocaine was determined to be 100 times more dangerous than crack. Despite the fact that they were the same substance, the difference really was just how fast it would actually begin to work and the fact that you could smoke it. So that 100-to-1 ratio meant that, yes, you would get an automatic 5-year minimum sentence if you were caught with 500 grams of cocaine, but you would also get that exact same 5-year minimum sentence if you were caught with 5 grams of crack. A huge difference. And again, crack was associated with the African American community, cocaine associated with the wealthy white community. Massive disparities there. And in 1994, Bill Clinton did recognize that this was a huge issue and causing a major disparity in incarceration rates. He stated and recognized that 1 in 3 African American men who were in their 20s were either in jail, on parole, or otherwise under any supervision of the criminal justice system. 1 in 3. Now, what did he do shortly after saying that? Well, 2 weeks after making that statement and recognizing that issue, the 1994 crime bill was passed and signed by him, which maintained that 100-to-1 ratio on crack to cocaine, added 3 strike laws for life incarceration, and then expanded policing specifically, which ended up specifically targeting and disproportionately affecting African Americans and Latinos. If we look at the prison population over time in the United States, it stays relatively stable for quite a while in the early 1900s. And then all of a sudden we see this massive spike in prison population. And if you look at the graph, you see that really comes about right around 1986, 1982, right when we're talking about these laws. When we also look at who's in prison, if we look at the general U.S. population, we see majority white, then Latino, then African American. State prison, pretty similar rates between the 3, but again, disproportionate to overall portion of the population. And then the last one, in the federal prison for drug offenses, we see a massive shift where Latino and Black inmates actually widely outproportion white offenders. So why is this? Well, I have a question for all of you. Is this potentially that there's different rates of drug use between African Americans and white Americans? Are they similar? Are they different? Give me your answers here. Tell me what you think.
Dan, while people are answering, there is a question about where did the name crack come from?
So that's a great question. Cocaine was named cocaine from the coca plant, which it was derived from. They actually taught us the synthesis of it in pharmacy school, which I always questioned as a good idea. But crack came from the form that name came about because when you mixed it with baking powder, it solidified as less of a powder into a rock-like substance that would crack apart. And in order to put it into a pipe to smoke, you'd have to crack the rock. So it became called crack rock or crack cocaine. So that's a great question, though. Feel free to type more questions in the chat if you have any. So what we see here is overwhelmingly we say, no, there's not a difference in the rate of drug use. And you're correct. There isn't a major difference in the rate of drug use. We look time and time again, and primarily white Americans tend to use more drugs on average than Black Americans, although it is very, very similar. The difference is not in the drug use, it's the enforcement of the drug policy. And that's where we see the incarceration rate change. So how this affects our modern crisis. So up to this point, we really focused on the war on drugs being a legal issue with the criminal justice system. But now when we talk about the opioid crisis, we talk about overdose numbers, addiction, the negative consequences of addiction. So what changed? Well, to simplify it, there's a lot of factors that led to the opioid crisis that we've seen over the last 15, 20 years. But there's 5 ones that really stick out in my mind. Each one on its own probably wouldn't have been enough to create this epidemic. But the fact that all of them were happening right around the same time, working in tangent with one another, is really where we got into danger. So the first is the war on pain. In the 1990s, pain was claimed to be the 5th vital sign by the VA health system. Just as important as pulse, respiratory rate, blood pressure, temperature. And although it's not a vital sign, I think this campaign gets a lot more flack than it's due. A lot of people blame the opioid epidemic on the war on pain. Some of you are probably thinking, okay, but aren't you also doing that by including it here? And that's a fair point. It does have a role in the development of this epidemic, but the problem is not with its intention. The idea that pain could be the 5th vital sign, that we needed to treat pain better, is absolutely a good idea. We do need to treat pain better. The problem was not the intent. The problem was not the slogan. The problem was not the idea that we needed to treat pain. The problem was the execution. You see, pain management education at the time was relatively limited in medical training. In 2001, the only data we had about quality of pain education in US medical schools was we had studies that said, do you have it or do you not have it? There was nothing evaluating how effective it was. In 2010, yes, just 10 years ago, Johns Hopkins did a study evaluating pain management education. And we found that only about 4% of US medical schools had a required pain course that specifically just focused on pain. The vast majority taught pain as a component of their other classes. So you might learn about diabetic neuropathy while you're learning in the endocrine system. You might learn about rheumatoid arthritis when you're in rheumatology. But there's no comprehensive look that combines all of it and sees how they interact and how you treat different types of pain conditions differently. What was really alarming to me as a pharmacist is that when it comes to schools that were talking about pharmacologic pain management, so specifically medicine that can be used for pain. So how do we use medications for pain? The average time that was spent, and this is just for the schools that did cover it, was 0.7 hours. So less than 1 hour focused on the intricacies of pain management with medications. So we set up this giant plan to say pain is the 5th vital sign. We need to improve on pain management. We need to get better. We need to take care of every single patient and properly treat their pain. And at the same time, we weren't training people how to actually do that effectively. Now, while this was going on, there was a major shift in the economy. In the 2000s, the US was really shifting away from a manufacturing economy into a service economy. And if you look at the map on the bottom left here of the percentage of manufacturing jobs lost, it really hits us here in the Rust Belt, Cincinnati and Ohio, Kentucky, Michigan, Indiana, Pennsylvania. And those are a lot of where we see the opioid crisis really starting and kicking off. If you look on the right-hand side here and see disability applications, if you look about where people were applying for disability in the United States, it almost is an overlay of where manufacturing jobs were lost. We see patients who are losing their job, losing their income, they're likely injured or hurting because we're talking about heavy manufacturing, steel, coal mining, things that really take a toll on the body. So you're seeing they're losing their jobs, they're losing their careers, they're in pain, they are going onto disability, they don't have a lot of upward mobility, there's anxiety with that, there's depression involved with that, there's pain involved with that. There's a lot of different circumstances that could put someone in a situation where they're vulnerable to becoming addicted to any substance, whether it's alcohol or cocaine or methamphetamine, whatever it might be. But they were going on disability. And if you look at the disability applications, roughly 25% of those patients on disability were on disability for back problems, and most specifically, chronic lower back pain. Which brings us to our next issue, health insurance. Chronic lower back pain is very hard and complex to treat. It's one of the most common things we see, but it's one of the things we are unfortunately one of the worst at actually treating. It needs to be comprehensive and individualized to the patient. Medications are certainly a part of it, but you also need effective physical therapy, potentially psychological therapy. You may need injections or other procedures or complementary therapies like CBT, acupuncture, yoga, things that have been shown to improve our function and pain over time. Medications aren't all of it, but what we do know about health insurance is what do they like to pay for? Medications. How can you truly assess the quality of psychological therapy someone's getting or the physical therapy they're getting? Health insurances don't like that. They like to say, oh, you got prescribed this med. We can look at the pharmacy. We can see that you picked it up. We can see that you're on it consistently, and we're able to track that. So really, unless you were well off, have really good insurance, or able to afford these out of pocket, or you had time to actually do these, because physical therapy, going to psychological therapy appointments, going to these things takes time. So if you were economically disadvantaged or didn't have this private insurance that was really nice, or were able to self-pay, you were getting medication only. And yes, insurance providers do not like to pay for anything, but they really do not like to pay for non-medication therapies. So medication really became the backbone of chronic lower back pain treatment for these patients. And again, medication therapy was the lowest thing taught in US medical schools at that time. At the same time, in 1996, Purdue Pharma came out with OxyContin. There was an article written to the editor in 1980 that's on the right, that short little paragraph. And you're probably wondering, where's the rest of it? And that is all of it. That is the entire thing. To the editor, I'm not going to read all of it, but it essentially says, we are two physicians who have looked through our case files, and we don't think that addiction is very common in patients on narcotics. There's no description of how they came to that conclusion, how the study was done, really much of anything. It's not even really a study. It's not peer reviewed. There's no methods. There's no randomization. No one has any idea how they got that conclusion, but it's there. So it didn't really make that much of an impact or make that much of a difference, because what was it? It was just two random people discussing their findings. But in 1996, if you look on the left, you all of a sudden see a massive spike in the number of citations of this paper. This was used widely by the pharmaceutical industry to show providers, especially in rural areas, that there weren't any risks to using this therapy. And again, these are providers who their least amount of their training in terms of pain management was specific to different types of medications. They also owned a prescriber database which could show them who was prescribing OxyContin, who was prescribing other pain medications that weren't OxyContin. And then they were able to look at that and target high poverty areas or areas where there were high applications to disability. They would talk to those physicians directly, wine and dine them, show them these studies that weren't even studies, show them that they should be using this, even though it was not appropriate for chronic lower back pain. And then they'd leave them and say, oh, here's some free trial coupons for your patients. So it's unsurprising to see that the majority of drug overdose deaths in the opioid crisis were in Appalachia, a population that had so many different risk factors going for them for the potential to develop an addiction. as well as the perfect storm of circumstances which led there to be a wide supply of opioids that were being used when it wasn't appropriate. And I don't want to make it seem like opioids should never be used, because opioids are an important part of our pain arsenal. They can be used, and they can even be used in chronic lower back pain. But they need to be used appropriately, and we need to use them as part of a comprehensive strategy to treat pain when it's needed. It cannot be the strategy for pain. So in 2010, opioid prescribing peaked, and we realized that opioid overdoses have doubled since 2000. So in 10 years, we doubled opioid overdoses. So we freaked out and said, oh my gosh, there's an opioid crisis. What are we going to do? So let's see if we can predict what Americans would do. So historically, based on our Harrison Narcotic Act and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which of these aspects of drug use, which of these aspects had the biggest impact on the development of our drug policy? Was it the danger of the drug, or was it the people who use the drug? So in the interest of time, I can already see it going. It's more towards the people who use the drug. So when we develop drug policy in the United States, historically, it's more related to who uses the drug than the drug itself. So a follow-up question, how do we typically respond to drug use? What do we use for this policy? Do we rely on the criminal justice system, or do we rely more heavily on the public health system? And again, we're starting to see criminal justice system take it away. So there's a famous phrase that I really like and appreciate that says, every crime needs a victim. So who is the victim here? Who is the victim and who is the villain? Patients addicted to opioids, pharmaceutical companies, physicians. So in the interest of time, as you guys keep going, I'll start talking about this. But really, who was the victim? We saw the victim as the patients. The patients, it was a tragedy. It wasn't people who were bad, who were using these drugs. We started to empathize and realize that, oh my gosh, this has happened to people who it hasn't happened to before. What's going on? So what did we see? Well, all throughout the news, we saw victims of addiction, victims of the opioid crisis, young, white, and middle class. It changed all the language that we use to describe addiction. And that's a good thing. We shouldn't be focusing on addiction without blame. It's a medical disease. It's something that needs to be treated. But it's a drastically different approach to what we saw previously. So at this point in 2010, let's map out our patient population to see what happens. So we have patients really in 5 main areas. We have patients who are on non-opioid therapy and their pain is controlled. At that time, because of how we were treating pain, we didn't really use a lot of the therapies that we should be using. So that is a smaller group. We have patients who are then on prescription opioids for their pain. We then have patients who are misusing prescription opioids. We have patients who are using non-prescription opioids. And then we will have incoming patients who have untreated pain but have yet to come into the healthcare system. So let's look and track and see what we really did. Well, our focus was, okay, pain patients are the victims. The villains are big pharma, overprescribers. So we're going to punish overprescribers, increase our DEA monitoring, punish big pharma, and ultimately we put intense legal pressure on physicians to limit opioid prescribing as fast as possible. And if we think about that, who is that really protecting? Was the changing limits protecting our patients? Not really. It was from legal pressure. We were protecting ourselves as healthcare providers. And that makes sense because there was immediate pressure and we were seeing the concern and the damage that had been done, and we wanted to reverse that damage, and we were under legal pressure to do so. It makes sense to do so. But it wasn't to protect patients. So what happened to those patients? Well, the patients who were on RX opioids, and again, some of those, many because of how we were prescribing them, didn't need to be on them, but many of were patients who were taking RX opioids appropriately. We hope that they would move into that patients who are controlled on non-opioid therapy category, but we really didn't do anything to actually improve our ability to treat pain, how we're covering pain management therapies, how we're setting up our system to really provide these multimodal treatments. So not as many patients went there. Mostly, patients either went into the category of having untreated pain and dealing with untreated chronic pain, or they may have turned to using non-prescription opioids to try to get pain relief. When it comes to the patients who are misusing our prescription opioids, they were pretty quickly identified. And what happened? Well, we kicked them out of our treatment because I'm not going to be prescribing you opioids, you're misusing them. But we're not very good at addiction treatment here in the United States, so not many of them ended up going into treatment. Most of them who had an opioid use disorder and were not in treatment and no longer had access to their prescription opioids used non-prescription opioids. It's pretty simple maneuver there. For our patients who are using non-prescription opioids, well, hopefully they went into treatment. And if not, which again, we were bad at treating, they either hopefully stayed as patients who were using non-RX opioids, or they may have died from overdose. And for our patients with untreated pain, we didn't want to go and give them prescription opioids. So we relied on non-opioid therapy, which is incredibly helpful and can be done for so many people. But we didn't improve our ability to really provide that therapy. So we weren't putting them in the non-opioid therapy box. We weren't putting them in the pain on RX opioid box. They were either staying with untreated pain or again, moving to patients using non-prescription opioids. And again, hopefully in treatment or staying in that category. And unfortunately, many of them died from overdose. So the result of this, opioid prescribing peaked in 2010. But if we look at opioid overdoses, it's peaking now. It started peaking later, and we start to see synthetic opioids all of a sudden become a major problem in the mid-2010s. So what caused that shift? Illicitly manufactured fentanyl in the 2016 CDC guidelines. Illicit manufactured fentanyl became a major problem because fentanyl is much more potent than morphine. It works no differently than these medications, than other opioids. It works the same way, but it takes a lot less to have the same effect. And fentanyl began popping up in the drug supply. So if someone was going to use their normal dose of heroin and there was fentanyl in it and they didn't know about it, they would accidentally overdose themselves and potentially die from unintentional overdose. At the same time, in 2016, the chronic pain guidelines came out from the CDC. These had generally good recommendations. Some were not so great and not evidence-based, but for the most part, they talked about trying to use the lowest effective dose of an opioid in combination with appropriate non-opioid therapies. But again, we still didn't have the system in place to effectively use those non-opioid therapies. And Americans do this thing where we don't like to read beyond the headline. So when they have a recommendation, and at the end of it, it's stated, for the most part, most patients don't need opioids for acute pain for more than 3 days. That's what people took from it. But if you read right afterwards, the part that's not the headline that explains this is only for patients who are experiencing acute pain in the primary care setting, not related to cancer, not related to trauma, not related to surgery, not related to spinal issues, not post-surgical, not post-op. There's all those exceptions. But we didn't make those exceptions. We made policies, we looked at the headline, not the exceptions. So states like Florida then said, okay, well, we're going to limit all acute opioid prescriptions to 3 days. But they didn't have those other exceptions for those other situations. We actually saw the same authors who wrote the CDC guidelines in 2016 come out in 2019 to talk about how misapplied they've been and how much harm it's caused. But the guidelines are still out there, and that's still how we base policy today. So we saw this massive shift from all of these factors of patients who could be prescribed non-opioid therapy and treated effectively, or could be prescribed safe opioid therapy and treated effectively, ultimately pushed to non-prescription opioids or left to suffer with untreated pain. And because of how much more dangerous that population had it, because of illicit fentanyl, we start to see a massive rise in overdose. Nationally, synthetic opioids like fentanyl make up the majority of our overdose deaths, whereas commonly prescribed opioids are becoming less and less of an overdose risk. Here in Hamilton County, we see the purple line of fentanyl is the vast majority of our overdose deaths. Second in causing overdose is cocaine overdose. But if we look further, 87% of those cocaine overdoses are actually related to fentanyl. It is an illicit fentanyl overdose crisis. And it is in part due to how we overcorrected and over-responded and forgot what we learned from history in regards to the first opioid crisis. So I'm going to skip this in the interest of time because I know I'm going over and Colleen's probably upset with me. We also see disparities in access to buprenorphine treatment, which is the standard of care for opioid use disorder. White Americans make up the vast majority of patients who are able to receive buprenorphine treatment. And if you look at insurance providers, those who have private insurance or are able to self-pay make up the vast majority of patients who are actually in treatment. The demographics of opioid use and unintentional drug overdose are also changing. We're getting better at treating patients for addiction. We're getting better at providing buprenorphine treatment. We're not good, but we're getting better. But again, a lot of patients, especially in our African American community, are missing out on that. And that's why now we actually have more unintentional drug overdose deaths in the African American community than we do in any of the other communities. So really what we've seen is patients who have pain are being undertreated. They're being forced to taper off their pain medications because guidelines are being misapplied. Substance use disorder patients are not being treated for their substance use disorder. The most effective medications that we have for substance use disorder are limited by policies such as X waivers and morphine clinics that patients have to go to every single day. Limitations of policy, like if you're in jail, you can only receive opioid antagonist treatment, which is why we see an incredible rate of opioid overdose in patients who were recently released from jail. We're not in a great spot. We're not in the same opioid crisis that we were, but we're in an overdose crisis. So how do we respond? Well, we have patients in these three categories: untreated pain, patients using non-prescription opioids, and patients who are dying from overdose. Where we need to go is we need to have patients in treatment, patients who are controlled on non-opioid therapy, and then patients who are controlled on prescription opioid therapy. Now, that last group, prescription opioid therapy in long-term patients, is going to be a lot smaller because most patients really don't need chronic opioids. But that's only if we're treating them appropriately with our non-opioid therapies. So how do we get there? Really, we need to understand how we got here, recognize we made mistakes, but not overcorrect them. We need to be empathetic and meet people where they are. For patients with untreated pain, our goals can't simply be, okay, you're a good prescriber because you have less opioids you're prescribing. It needs to be based on how your patients are doing. How effectively are you using your non-opioid therapies? Are you using prescription opioids more so than you should be, and you're not using non-opioid therapies to go along with it? Are you just trying to rely solely on opioid monotherapy? Those are much better markers for how we're doing than simply looking at the number of opioids we prescribe or dispense. For patients who are on prescription opioids, we want to work with them, meet them where they're at. If they're stable, keep them on it. If there are non-opioid therapies they're not maximized on, we want to maximize those and get them onto them. If patients are misusing prescription opioids, find out why, move them into a category, because if it's someone who needs treatment, they should be receiving pain treatment. If it's someone who needs treatment for addiction, we should be moving them into addiction. We don't want to push them to non-prescription opioids. And then for the patients who are using non-prescription opioids, we want to get them into treatment. And if they require pain management, we want to get them into that treatment. But the biggest thing we can do is put this box around them and keep them from dying from an overdose. If they stay in that category of using non-prescription opioids, that's okay. It's not preferred. I'd rather get them into treatment. I'd rather move them into pain management if they need it, or opioid use disorder treatment. But one thing I've learned over and over in this field is it's really hard to treat a patient when they're dead. So we might not be able to get all of them into treatment, but we can keep them alive and go from there. Distributing naloxone, working in harm reduction to get sterile syringes to people, actually going out and giving fentanyl test strips so patients can test their supply to make sure they don't accidentally overdose. It's going to be crucial to overcoming this epidemic. Ultimately, we need to meet people where they are, recognize we made a mistake and not punish them for the mistakes of us as healthcare providers, and start over with a new attitude and a new approach, individualizing patient care, and then we can begin to improve it. And that's all I have today. I wanted to include my references here, and then open the floor to any questions, as well as put the CE up there. I apologize for everyone and Brianna Coggins who invited me here, and I went straight to 7 o'clock instead of having the time for questions. I apologize for that, but I'm happy to open it to any questions for those who want to stay on. And you can always reach out to me and send me an email if you have any follow-up questions as well.
And Bree has put her email address in there. If you do have questions, you can send them to her, and she will get them to Dan for his response. It's been a wonderful absolutely wonderful session, Dan. So informative, and most of the comments right now in the chat are thanking you for what a great session it was, and how interested they were, and appreciative. And we do want to be, certainly aware of everyone's time. And thank you so much for being with us this evening and listening to Dan and learning from Dan, since we've all learned so much. And as I said, if you have a question, you can just send it to Bree, and she will make sure that that Dan gets it. I want to thank you very much, Dan. If you have any kind of a closing statement you'd like to share.
Ooh, put me on the spot. I saw some mention about contact information. I can put that in the chat as well. I guess what my closing statement is really, when it comes to pain, when it comes to addiction, anything with opioids, at the end of the day, the thing that matters is to meet with the patient, be empathetic, understand where they're coming from, and go from there. We don't celebrate the little victories a lot in medicine. If someone comes to you and they're inappropriately treated and they're on 300 milligrams of morphine a day by itself, and it's not helping them at all, and they're not on any other prescriptions or any other programs, and we're able to add those on to the point where they're not needing that opioid as much, but we only get them down to 200 or 250 or whatever it is, that's a win. It's not a loss of, oh, they're still taking too much or something like that. It's, okay, we screwed up. Let's see what we can do and get you to a place where you're taken care of. Because it's not the patient's fault. They didn't prescribe themselves that. They didn't not cover it or refuse to cover it. So that's really kind of my closing message is everything's individualized. There are guidelines for a reason, but there's also the need to listen to your patients and believe in them.
Great point to end on. And again, thank you everyone so much for staying and listening. And if you do have any questions, please reach out to Bree, and we'll be sure to answer them for you. Thanks so much, and good evening.
Thank you. Just realized I said I was going to put my email information, and I didn't do that.
Yeah, we're sending out a post-event email, so I can put that in there too, just so they have easy access to it. If you're comfortable with that, it'll just be to all the registrants.
That's fine.
I'm just gonna like copy the whole chat stream to make sure I don't miss anything.
Yeah, I apologize.
That's okay.
I made sure when I got to looking at the clock towards the end, I was like, okay, I've obliterated the question period, but at least I'm going to stop at 7 so I don't go overtime at the end. So sorry.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Well, I was looking at your slides because you had sent them ahead. I'm like, well, he cut out a lot, so I'm confident that he'll at least finish the content on time.
I cut a lot, yes.
I was texting Bree that I was a little nervous.
I was too. I sent it to you all with the full awareness that I was going to need to cut it.
It was great, though. It was very interesting.
Well, thank you.
I'm gonna save the whole thing. Yeah, so I see the question from Earl and Melka, so I'll follow up with them. No, I feel really great about it. I mean, Christine, you were really amazing with moderating, and everything was really natural and
Of course she was.
great. I know Shelley missed the opening.
I know, I missed everything. I had a meeting at 5:30 that ran over. I didn't get done until like almost 6:30, so I'm anxious to get the recording.
Yes,
It was
perfect.
great. We had a great turnout. It was really a great turnout.
Sure
Yeah,
did.
Yeah, about 80 at most.
Yeah.
So that was great. And so more than 50%. But good. Yeah. So I can close out the meeting here, but just wanted to say thank you. And like I said, we'll send out a post-event email to our registrants. So with the recording too. So if people weren't able to join or if they wanted to go back and review, they'll have that as well. So I'm going to stop recording now, actually.